Something is happening to Russia's soldiers for every square kilometer of Ukraine that they gain. They vanish. Hundreds of them at a time, in what is a completely unnatural way for Russia to wage war. Putin has to face the fact the maths doesn't add up anymore. With 167 soldiers dead for every square kilometer captured, the brutal maths we see now means that Russia can't survive its historic losses. And more needs to be done to make sure that Russia feels the pain. But we'll come back to what that is later in the video. For now, let's look at the numbers courtesy of Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. In a February 23rd interview with the Financial Times, Zelenskyy laid out the stark reality of Putin's blundering invasion for all to see. In 2025 alone, Russia lost an average of 167 people per kilometer of occupied territory, Zelenskyy told the outlet. It's unclear if Ukraine's president means straight kilometers or square kilometers, though it's likely the latter, as most gains are measured in square kilometers. What we see in this simple number alone is that Putin's strategy of churning through his soldiers to try and break Ukraine just isn't working. The losses are too massive, the gains are too small. And we can see all of that when we run through the numbers. According to the Moscow Times, the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, claims that 2025 saw Russia make the largest gains that it's made since the beginning of the war. That's a spurious claim due to Russia's propensity for lying about what it's captured, as we'll cover in a few minutes. But what it ultimately adds up to is that Russia claimed a little over 5,600 square kilometers of Ukraine last year, assuming the ISW's figures are accurate. Even as the best year for gains that Russia has seen so far, that still only amounts to 0.94% of Ukraine's territory, meaning that Russia still has another 80% or so to go before Putin can fulfill his goal of shattering Ukraine. That alone makes for some pretty bad maths for Russia. Another 80 years of fighting will be needed if it maintains its current level of advance. Returning to Zelenskyy's numbers and assuming that he means square kilometers, then Russia will have lost 167 of its soldiers for each of those 5,600 square kilometers. Multiply those figures and you get staggering losses of 935,200. That seems high. Other estimates, such as those shared by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, suggest that Russia actually seized 4,831 square kilometers of Ukraine in 2025. That would lead to total troop losses of almost 807,000. Either way, these are massive losses, assuming that the figures being provided about how much territory Russia gained last year are accurate. For context, the Center for Strategic and International Studies estimates that Russia suffered 415,000 casualties in 2025, which is half or less than the numbers we just came to, based on Zelenskyy's claim. Does that mean that Zelenskyy's average is inaccurate, or does it mean that Russia has been overestimating its gains, leading sources like the ISW do the same, and that the amount of territory that Russia has captured in 2025 is actually far lower than believed? You can probably guess which one it is. But before we dig into that, let's transplant Zelenskyy's numbers into 2026. In a February 20th report, the ISW said that it had collected evidence that suggests that Russia has captured 572 square kilometers of Ukraine so far in 2026, which is a difference of 328 square kilometers compared to what Russia claims. If we take the ISW's figures as given, it will mean that Russia has churned through over 95,500 of its soldiers in less than 2 months of this year. That number, as crazy as it is, may be accurate. In January alone, Ukraine claims that its drones killed over 30,000 of Russia's soldiers. Assuming a similar rate of deaths in February, that will be 60,000 kills scored by drones alone. And note that we said kills and not casualties. The 30,000 figure only takes into account recorded kills made by Ukraine's drones that have been uploaded to the country's Delta system. It doesn't account for Russian wounded, captured, or AWOL soldiers, nor does it account for soldiers who have been killed in ways that Ukraine couldn't record and verify. Suddenly, 95,500 doesn't seem like too large a figure. And if that's the case, then numbers that we saw for 2025 indicate that Russia may well be losing far more soldiers than even Ukraine has estimated in the past. We can also take the maths one step deeper. If we assume that Russia maintains its rate of advance that we've seen so far in 2026, that means it's gaining 11.44 square kilometers per day, assuming the ISW's 572 square kilometer figure covers the period from January 1st to February 19th. With 315 days left in the year from that period, Russia will gain another 3,603.6 square kilometers on top of the 572 it has, adding up to 4,175.6 square kilometers, substantially less than it's believed to have captured in 2025. What we see here is Russia's assaults weakening. It's taking less territory as it loses more soldiers, and the reality is that Putin can't keep this up. As The Telegraph reported on February 24th, Western officials now believe that Russia has been suffering about 40,000 casualties per month since at least November 2025. That roughly aligns with the figures we have for the first 2 months of 26, at least as far as estimates go. Russia's problem, the outlet says, is that it's only managing to recruit around 35,000 troops per month to sustain the invasion. This is Russia slowly breaking. After 4 years of fighting, Putin is now in the position where his manpower-heavy strategy is coming back to bite him. Assuming that these numbers remain the same, Russia's military manpower is now dropping by at least 5,000 soldiers per month, and the number may even be higher. As for Ukraine, it plans to twist the knife now that it's buried it deep into Russia's side. Zelenskyy says that Ukraine is seeking to score 50,000 eliminations against Russia's military per month in 2026, which he believes would lead to a war-ending scenario for Russia. It's hard to argue with Ukraine's president. That would create a deficit of 15,000 soldiers each month for Russia, which will eat into a military that hasn't grown in 6 months. Russia's troop numbers have flatlined at 711,000 over the past half a year, Euromaidan Press says, and the deficit that we're starting to see now means that flatlining will soon be declining. There's simple logic to follow here. The fewer soldiers that Russia has in Ukraine, the weaker its attacks become. With weaker attacks comes the ability for Ukraine to retain territory while picking off even more Russian soldiers. So we may find that in 2026, Russia starts losing more than the average of 167 soldiers per square kilometer that we saw in 2025, and it takes even less of Ukraine to boot. Hey, at least that means that Russia is finally the best at something. It's at the top of the world for experiencing historic losses for every square kilometer that it's gained in Ukraine. So we've sent a lot of numbers your way during the last couple of minutes. Let's take a breather for a second to remind you that you are watching The Military Show. There's a lot more where this came from, so hit subscribe if you're getting value from our channel. Now, there's a lot more that Zelenskyy revealed during his discussion with the Financial Times, including how the reality of Russia's situation should be affecting peace talks. Stick with us as we'll cover that topic soon. But before we do, we told you earlier that the numbers we get from Zelenskyy's claims of 167 Russian casualties for each square kilometer gained may seem a little high. We also mentioned that the estimates for how much territory Russia actually captured in Ukraine may not be fully accurate. Zelenskyy covered that point in his interview, stating, "You can see immediately what they are occupying and what they are not. Where they claim to be holding positions, you can see they're not holding anything." This is a revelation. It tells us that per Ukraine's findings, Russian territorial gains in 2025 and 26 may not be as high as the estimates being provided by Western sources. In other words, Russia has been lying about what it's taken, leading to inaccurate numbers that could be the reason why the average number of Russian soldiers being killed per square kilometer gives us numbers for 2025 that are veering close to the total number of casualties that Russia has suffered during the entire war. Something doesn't add up here, and it's all due to Russia's bogus claims. In the same piece where it revealed how much territory it believes Russia has gained in 2026, the ISW also shared claims made by the Russian chief of the General Staff's main operations directorate, Colonel General Sergei Rudskoy. According to Rudskoy, Russia claims to have seized 900 square kilometers of Ukraine so far in 2026, which includes 42 settlements. We already covered how that's off by well over 300 square kilometers. But in 2025, Rudskoy also claims that Russia seized 6,700 square kilometers and more than 300 settlements in Ukraine. That's higher than any number we've seen so far, and frankly, it's a lie. ISW has only collected evidence to assess that Russian forces seized only 252 settlements in 2025, the ISW claims. Zelenskyy is right. Russia exaggerates its gains to make it look like it's doing better than it really is in Ukraine. This has become common practice for Russia. Way back in 2025, another ISW briefing revealed that Russian military bloggers were already starting to claim that Russia, and in particular its army chief Valery Gerasimov, was exaggerating its battlefield gains in Ukraine. The ISW assessed that Russia had seized almost 1,200 square kilometers fewer than the 3,500 square kilometers that Gerasimov claimed had been taken between March and September 2025. It's lies, and it's continued into 2026. We saw that from the ISW figures earlier, which took more than a 300 square kilometer bite out of Russia's claims to have captured 900 square kilometers this year. France 24 adds that Christina Harwood, who is the ISW's Russia deputy team lead, claims that Russian advances are coming at a literal foot pace and that this is not the picture that the Russians are trying to paint. Keep that last statement in mind. It'll be important when we come to the topic of peace talks. There's one more thing to cover before we finally move away from the numbers. In his interview with the Financial Times, Zelenskyy adds that it's not just Russia's slow pace of advance in return for a brutal and massive sacrifice of soldiers that has to concern Putin. On the contrary, we have advanced, Zelenskyy says when referring to gains that Ukraine has been making along the southeastern front of the country in the wake of SpaceX's decision to ban the use of the unauthorized Starlink terminals that Russia relied on for communication and drone operations. This is backed up by Ukraine's military chief Alexander Syrskyi, who said on February 23rd that Ukraine has managed to regain about 400 square kilometers of territory in its southeastern counteroffensive. Assuming this figure is correct, does that mean we can subtract what Ukraine has gained in 2026 from the 572 square kilometers that the ISW estimates Russia to have seized during the year? If we can, that then means the sum total of Russia's advance in Ukraine so far adds up to 172 square kilometers, which is an absolutely pathetic return when the country is losing anywhere between 30,000 and 45,000 soldiers per month. But the maths isn't adding up for Putin anymore. And according to Zelenskyy, that means now is the time to pile even more pressure onto Russia's leader during peace talks. We mentioned peace talks a few times already. Right now, Putin is trying to paint a picture of the Ukrainian army in crisis. The lies about how much territory Russia has seized, along with Russia's refusal to discuss its casualties, are being carefully constructed to make it seem like the end is nigh for Ukraine. Russia's overwhelming force is more than Ukraine can handle, Putin wants the world to believe, and it's only a matter of time before Ukraine crumbles. In particular, Putin wants to communicate this message to the US and President Donald Trump. Zelenskyy says that the real mass that we see now on the battlefield should be enough to push the US into pressuring Russia rather than Ukraine to come to a peace agreement. Trump has to see through the games, Zelenskyy says, as he tells the Financial Times, "I see it because they are very poor actors. They are playing with Trump and playing with the entire world. That's how it is. Putin thinks he looks convincing and that he can be trusted. No, he is a bad actor." Zelenskyy adds that the scale of Russia's losses means the country is as desperate for a pause to the fighting as Ukraine. That alone shatters the narrative that Putin is trying to feed to the US of Ukraine being a country that is on the brink of defeat. And we also see the extent of Russia's desperation in some wheeling and dealing that is trying to engage in behind the scenes of the Ukraine war peace talks. According to Zelenskyy, Russia has offered the US an economic cooperation package that is worth $12 trillion. That package reportedly contains certain provisions about Ukraine. Zelenskyy reports Ukraine's intelligence services as determining. Reading between the lines, this is basically Russia trying to bribe the US with trillions of dollars to pressure Ukraine into ceding the Donbass, which is what Putin has wanted since peace talks began. But as Zelenskyy notes, there's no guarantee that Russia would stop at the Donbass once it has it. Honestly, I do not believe that this is all that Russia demands, our withdrawal from Donbass, and then the war will end. Russia is Russia, and you know you cannot trust them, Zelenskyy tells the Financial Times. Russia isn't even trying to be secretive about this offer. Kirill Dmitriev, who is the CEO of Russia's direct investment fund, even took to X to dangle the economic cooperation package in front of America. Dmitriev even quotes a higher number than Zelenskyy as he pushes for the US to lift sanctions on Russia. Fake news. The US will eventually lift sanctions because sanctions on Russia cost US businesses $300 billion plus. Lifting sanctions on Russia is in the US interest, he declares in his post, before adding, the portfolio of potential US-Russia projects is over $14 trillion. Russia is trying to reduce what it's doing in Ukraine to a business deal. That cannot be allowed to work. Putin has spent over a year weaponizing peace talks, and in doing so, he has managed to tip the scales of war in Moscow's favor, the Japan Times reports. In other words, Putin has successfully created the image of Ukraine being on the verge of collapse, and the Kremlin is now using obscene amounts of money in an effort to convince the US to apply even more pressure on Ukraine to capitulate. The manpower maths we've just shared cuts right through all of that. It exposes Putin as the liar, thief, and charlatan that Ukraine has always claimed him to be, and it should be a sign to the US that the pressure has to be placed on Putin. What costs the Russian dearly is stopping their shadow fleet, stopping their companies, their ability to trade, to export energy resources from Russia, stopping sanctions evasion, Zelenskyy tells the Financial Times in what amounts to a call for Trump to ignore Dmitriev's claims that the US will benefit from lifting sanctions. The implication here is that these are claims being made by Russia because it's getting desperate. Putin is trying to hide it, but their numbers don't lie. Pressure must be applied to Russia in the wake of the revelations of just how much the country is losing for its scant gains in Ukraine. And not all of that pressure has to be applied by the US. The European Union or EU can play its part, both on the sanctions front and by fast-tracking Ukraine's ascension to the EU. I want a date. I'm asking for it. Let us not allow the next leaders or the next generation to face a situation where Russia blocks Ukraine's EU membership for 50 years, Zelenskyy says. On the pressure front, Ukraine being a member of the EU would cause more problems than Putin realizes. It would place Ukraine front and center of a powerful economic bloc that is already damaging Russia with sanctions. A deeper Ukrainian influence in the EU could lead to even better economic sanctions, all of which eat away at Russia's ability to sustain a war that has already cost it so much on the battlefield. As the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change notes, Ukraine's joining the EU also deepens the defensive cooperation between it and the EU's members. Ukraine brings with it a growing defense sector and one of the most technologically innovative populations on the planet, but it's not like this is a one-way deal. Ukraine's ascension to the EU boosts trade and offers just as much to the EU as it does to Ukraine, with the latter also getting the collective bargaining power that could make it a real force in peace talks that often seem like they're being conducted by the US and Russia, with Ukraine as an afterthought. Ultimately, it all comes down to what we've discussed earlier in the video. Despite all of Putin's claims, the maths no longer adds up for Russia. 167 Russian soldiers are dying for every square kilometer of Ukraine that is gained. And the scale of Russia's gains appears to have been exaggerated to an insane extent. Russia can no longer recruit the people that it needs to sustain its cannon fodder campaign, and Ukraine is now making gains, all of which means that the paint is peeling on the picture that Putin has created. Now is time to put the pressure on Putin. Russia's leader is weaker in 2026 than he's ever been, and that weakness runs through to his military. Historic losses and brutal maths have exposed the Ukraine invasion for what it really is, an abject failure. And on it will go. Russia will continue losing record numbers of soldiers as Ukraine's FPV drone swarms and its kill zones rack up the casualties. Russia has already suffered the largest troop losses in modern history, and Putin's war is over. He just doesn't know it. Find out more in our video. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe if you want to see more analysis from the Military Show. Thank you as always for watching.